So if you could be in a fictional television show, which one would you want to be in and why?
Would you be able to, like, would I have to be myself in that show, or am I picking a character from a show?
Either way, whichever way you want to go with it.
Well, then I'm Smallville and I'm Superman. And
Heck yeah.
Yeah, that's where I'm at.
Man, you're gonna have to give me a minute. You'll have to go. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't.
Yeah, I thought it would be something like, I always thought I would like to do something like in a superhero movie or whatnot, but I don't know that, or superhero television show, but I don't know that. I don't watch a whole lot of like television shows. I just finished watching the, I didn't get through all of it, but that show Severance. That show was trippy, and it was like, I'm like, I wouldn't want to be in that show.
Yeah, I think I would have probably more shows that I wouldn't want to be in.
Okay, so what's one that you wouldn't want to be in?
I mean, just like so you said Severance. Like I was thinking of shows that are notorious for like being good, but like Breaking Bad. Like Breaking Bad is one that it was a great show, but there's so much. It's like it's depressing in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Like it's like human brokenness on display, dude's life and family falling apart, and it's like, I don't know. It's just you watch, you're like, this is a great drama, but I'm glad this isn't my life, and I'm glad I'm not living in this narrative right now.
So I'll tell you a show. This is going to shock you as I say this. I would not want to be on this show, but I think it's one of the saddest shows ever made. Little House on the Prairie. Have you ever watched that show?
been
That
a long
show
time.
is dark.
I've not seen it for,
Every single episode has like the heaviest themes of like death and people getting sick and losing their eyesight and like, but I think being people like would go like, oh, it'd be so much fun being in the prairie days. No,
wasn't you and I just talking about that? Like how crazy it is, like the pioneers, the things that they did, and like the dangers they faced. Like I just was watching what was the series? It was on Netflix, American Primeval. And did you
I haven't
see that?
started it yet. I was going to start it.
It is like it's just
brutal.
It is brutal, but it also, anything that I've ever seen about pioneers is like on par with that show, and it's just total brutality. It's like you're in danger from robbers, you're in danger from like the indigenous, like the Native American tribes. Like it's like on every account, like starvation, winter, like there's like very little chance you actually make it to your destination and thrive. And that was the whole thing, is like people are like, the original American dream, like I'm going to go find a plot of land somewhere and live. And it's like your chances of making it there are basically slim to none.
Yeah, you cut your leg and you die.
Yeah.
Like you get an infection and you're
no
dead.
antibiotics. Yeah.
No antibiotics, right.
So the Oregon Trail was real? Like realistic?
Yeah.
Like you never get through that game. But
oh man.
Yeah. The whole idea, like, you know, we have statues, as we should. We have statues of like all these like American heroes throughout the years. All of the settlers should just have their own statues, because
seriously, like
the fact that our nation is because of them, that they braved just the unthinkable.
Yeah, for real.
I changed my mind. I would want to be on NCIS. I figured mine out.
You want to be on it?
Yeah, I'd want to be on NCIS.
Here's another one I wouldn't want to be on, is like anything like Walking Dead. Anything like where there's like
that was one I followed
zombies
up
like
until like the 8th or 9th season, until it just got so far off the rails. I was like, I don't know what's happening anymore. But that was actually a good drama. But you're exactly right. You're like, this would be the last situation I want to find myself in, a zombie apocalypse. That's another show. Again, great drama, super bleak, super dark, super depressing. Even like another popular one, Stranger Things, great show. But the things that are happening in that show, you're like, I wouldn't want to be a part of this either.
Yeah.
So yeah, when I look at a lot of the shows that I've watched, like, very entertaining, a lot of stuff going on. Most of it's not great though.
Yeah, would not want to live through.
Yeah, not something you want to live in.
Yeah, Monarch was the other one that I was thinking about. I'm like, I don't know that I want to live in a world where Godzilla and King Kong are real. Yeah. So, well, hey, welcome to the Branch Podcast. I'm here today with Pastor Anthony and Pastor Matthew, and we come together on this podcast and we talk about the theological topics and the sermons and break them down in greater detail and talk through some of the finer nuances that we don't always get a chance to get to on Sunday morning. And so we just sit down, we talk about it, and we try to lay it out and flesh it out as best we can. So thank you for listening. I'm back this week. I'm really happy to be back. I would not say that I was feeling like I was dying, but it was definitely annoying. So I'll say that.
It's good to have you back.
Yeah,
it's good to be back. Well, today we're going to be talking about your message from this past weekend, where you were talking about the idea of generosity and that being a important habit for us to embody as followers of Jesus, and for making God the priority with our resources, particularly with our finances. And you taught on the idea of tithing, in particular, and just the level of freedom that brings to our life. And that was the one thing that that really stuck out to me. You had a lot of great content, and you teach the concept of tithing so well. But the thing that stuck out to me was when you said at the end, this idea of we don't make, and you were talking about you and Mary, we don't make financial decisions anymore, or finances don't hinder or inhibit our decisions to be obedient. Right. It is essentially the way that you kind of came about it, and just speaking to the idea that tithing has allowed you to find freedom to follow God into anything that He's called you to, because you believe and trust that God is moving on your behalf, right. And so that really stuck out to me, and was a profound detail of the idea that we are not being invited into something that's a burden for us, but something that is to bring life and to bring freedom to our lives. And today, what I want to talk about is this idea that there are, as much as we talk about the freedom that tithing brings, there are still questions that people ask.
Sure.
There's pushback that people have when it comes to the idea of tithing, predominantly because we do see a lot of examples through the Old Testament of what it is and how it was commanded. We get into the New Testament, and it's far more nuanced in how we find it and how we think about it. And a lot of people will come back and have arguments against tithing. My personal conviction, and I know it's conviction of the three of us, is that tithing is that practice that brings freedom. But I just want to talk through the ideas and some of the questions that people have and some of the pushback that people have at times. And so just maybe it will help somebody come to the place where they can finally go, oh, this is something that I can be doing and is good for me to do. So I just want to start with that main concept then and ask this question: does the New Testament command tithing, and how should we think about it if it doesn't?
Yeah, so that's a hard question.
It's a broad question too. So
yeah,
I get it.
I mean, so does the New Testament command it? Well, Jesus did in one verse. I referenced it on Sunday where he's rebuking the spiritual leaders, religious leaders, I should say, mm-hmm. and he says, you tithe on everything down to even your spices, but you lack showing justice and kindness, love, mercy, like these concepts. And he goes, you should do these without neglecting tithing. Mm-hmm. So Jesus is not removing tithing at that point. But from that point forward, there's no question, I'm going to say this in a more broad sense, there's no question that for all of us, as we're processing through the scriptures, there's an element that we have to negotiate with the scriptures based on our understanding, based on our culture. And I'm not saying that the scriptures are necessarily subjective to whatever we feel or think, but that when we're talking about things of the Old Testament, specifically the law and what pertains to our lives now, the scripture doesn't define what that is. Mm-hmm. At one point, there was the clearly defined laws of God. In the New Testament, you can see even the early Christians struggling with it. Mm-hmm. They're trying to figure it out. In one season, they're like, hey, we got all these new converts. What should we tell them to do? They came together as a group. Their best guess at that point was all right, how about don't eat food to idols, be sexually pure.
Sure.
And I think they named a couple other things and does that sound good? And everyone's like, yep, good. And they're like, okay, let's tell them that. And they weren't being flippant about it, but they're still trying to navigate it. The reason why I say that is there was no point in the New Testament where someone sat down and said, these are the things you have to do. Mm-hmm, so right. What we see, this is going to be a super long answer, but what we see, oftentimes people will try to categorize the Old Testament laws, and they'll say these were the ceremonial laws, these were the civic laws, these were the moral laws, and now we're still under the moral laws, and the other ones were really not because Jesus fulfilled them. And that is a good guess, good explanation, a good starting mm-hmm. point, but the Bible doesn't say that, doesn't break it down that way, doesn't tell us which laws are which. So the reason why I say all of that is, if we are beginning with the question, do I have to do these things? That's where I think we start to find some difficulty. The better questions that I encourage our church to ask are questions like, what can I do to experience the fullness of what God has offered? So when I'm looking through the Old Testament laws, I'm not reading them as I still have to do these things, but I am still reading them as, well, what happens if I do the heart behind these things? Because mm-hmm. some of them are super obvious. Don't plant two types of crops in the same field. Okay, I'm not doing that, right?
Not super relevant to me.
Yeah, don't wear two types of fabrics together. Well, I have a bunch of bunch of clothes, most of my clothes, if not all of my clothes. I mean, once they invented stretchy pants, it's, it's a mixture of materials. So, but when I look at other things and I go, tithing being one of them, is there some value from that, that can add value to my relationship with God? I think there is.
Yeah.
And so when I see Jesus not reject it, I see there's still value. That's why I approach it that way, is to say, okay, are those things still true? So even like in the Old Testament law, they say, God tells them, he's like, okay, when you take in your crops, don't bring in everything all the way to the very edge. Like leave the edges to when you're harvesting, and every single tree that you're pulling from, don't take everything from it. Leave all of that for the sojourner, for the poor in your community. And that's a concept of generosity. I don't have any crops. I'm not a gardener or a farmer, but I can take those principles and go, I should have some margin in my resources that I can be generous with people. And I can also give generously to the church that I believe is a conduit to see that money out. So again, my relationship with the law is not one of, I have to do these 613 laws that God gave Abraham, but it is, the challenge to me is, but what can I learn from those things? What can I value in those things? So even today, I'm in a Leviticus in my own personal devotions, which there's some of it that I really like. There's some parts of Leviticus it's boring as watching paint dry, but even as I'm reading through them, I'm putting like literally today, before I even knew what we were talking about. I mean, I knew kind of what we were talking about just because I preached on Sunday, but I was in my own notes writing what is there today that is still of value about these things. So God gave them. It's in Leviticus like 21, 22, around there. He's like, these are the things I want you to keep celebrating: a Sabbath, a Passover, Feast of Weeks. Like he lists all these things. And I literally wrote in my notes, research this more to see, is there some value in these principles I could still add to my life today? Sorry, I talked a long time, but does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely. I think you see Jesus do it with the Sabbath when he's walking with his disciples and he's interacting with the Pharisees. They have this strict idea that I have to do this for me to honor Sabbath. Jesus comes along, does it differently, but honors the heart of the Sabbath, because Sabbath is still a principle that he recognizes was God given for the good of our hearts and our lives. Yeah. And so I think very similarly along the same lines with tithing, that it is this idea that like we have this practice, this principle that is for our freedom and for life, and it is beneficial to what we do, whether it's strictly commanded or just modeled for us as a path to life.
And the challenge that I shared briefly on Sunday, and I wanted to be careful because whenever you handle something that's kind of a serious topic and you handle it quickly, it's really easy to come across as like snarky. And I didn't want to be that.
Sure.
But when someone is like, we're not under the law, we don't have to do this, where I really do struggle with that principle is when you look at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he's consistently addressing the law, but he's addressing the heart behind it. And if you just look at it, the heart behind the law always elevates the expectations of what you do. It's not adding layers of legalism. That's not what I mean when I say raise the bar. It's just there's a higher expectation in your behavior so that you can be blessed more, in the sense of like, it's a better way to live. So when he says, like, you've heard it said, do not murder, I tell you, don't be angry. He's not trying to raise the bar so now you have this legalistic standard you have to meet. It's literally God, your creator, saying, you will be better not being angry. Right? Like, and it reflects me well. So it honors God, but it also is a better way to live. And so like in that, I say, like, I just have it hard to believe that when Jesus is showing us the heart behind it, that when he got to the part of don't store up treasures here on earth, but store it up in heaven, that he wasn't implying a higher level of expectation in our giving. I don't feel like he was lowering the bar to say like, now you have to give or can give less. I think he was showing like generosity, go to this place of deep faith in God. And I know Anthony and I talked about that even this week, where he was like, yeah, okay, fine. You want to reject tithing? Then embrace the New Testament posture, like Acts chapter 2. Yeah. And it's like, sell everything. Give everything.
Yeah. Well, I think it usually in the context of conversations with people who give pushback about tithing, I mean, we kind of joked about this. They're always arguing in the sense of, okay, what is your motivation? It's like, you're trying to give less, right? So like, if I can somehow maybe abolish the idea of tithing, well, then I can give less and not feel bad about it. But again, it is what you just said. It's like, if you're going to try to use the New Testament to say, well, the New Testament doesn't teach tithing. The question then is, okay, well, what does the New Testament teach about generosity? Because Jesus has a ton to say about money. You taught about it on Sunday, particularly how money can be a snare to our hearts. I was having a conversation earlier today. I think money is the chief competitor for our affections. It is the ultimate pseudo-God in that it can promise us things that ultimately only God should be and could be providing in our lives. The idea of security, the idea of, with money, I can do the things that I want to do, with power, influence, all of this stuff. Money is this fake God, which is why I think Jesus teaches so much on it and talks about it, because it is one of those things that we struggle with as an idol. And so instead of giving our allegiance to money and putting our trust in money, the idea is generosity helps to free us from that illusion to put our trust fully in God. But more than that, I think even beyond what Jesus teaches, I mean, all throughout the New Testament, Chris and I were just having a conversation about this, but when Paul talks about giving, the Corinthians are taking up an offering, right? Like, he tells them actually to set aside weekly, finances for this offering that they're going to take. To the Philippians, they see generosity as partnering with Paul in his missionary journeys. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul literally outlines just the idea that in the same way that the people of God in the Old Testament, they supported the temple and the temple workers, that today the ministry is going to be supported by the people of God. So you see all of these different themes and principles. As you mentioned, Acts chapter 2, people actually come, give all that they have, give it to the church, and then they allot it to people as they have need. So there's even entrusting the church to be able to do what is necessary as they're led by the Spirit. But the reality is, you see generosity across the entire New Testament. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, as you've said many times, like, I'm not interested in looking at the bare minimum gospel, like the bare minimum requirements. Sure, yeah. What is the spirit of the New Testament, even in what should the church look like? I mean, if you were to ask a Christian, do you think Christians should be generous or not? I think most people would say, yeah, we should be generous. We should want to yield every area of our lives to God so that we can trust Him, but also thinking about money even as a tool and a resource that we can use to partner with God to do more good and to further His kingdom in this world.
Now, thinking through that whole idea of like God calling us to generosity, that can seem like a very, we get the idea of the tithe and it being 10% of our income. We talk about generosity and that can feel kind of squishy, for lack of better terms. There's a lot of subjectivity to what does it mean to be generous? Do I give away $5 a week, or do I give away $1,000 a week? You know what I mean? Like, what does the idea of having the 10%, like, how does that help establish this practice of generosity and set the baseline for living a life and fostering generosity in our lives?
Well, I think you just answered it. I think what it does is it gives us a baseline, because it is so subjective. So you say, like, what is a generosity? Well, if I just take my resources and I then allot it to every single thing that I want to do, and then with what's left over, I give to God however much, 1%, 2%, and I give that to God, and that makes me comfortable. Like, to me, does that really honor the heart of God? So, like, I think there are some key components when we're talking about generosity. That's why I think tithing gives us that baseline where it says this is the starting point, because of how God even worded the tithe. He said, that's mine. That's not yours, that's mine. So it is the first part that I think enters us into that partnership relationship with God, where we say, okay, you've given me 100%, but you said this 10% is yours. I'm giving back to you. I'm faithfully stewarding back to you what you've said. So now we're here, we're connected, I'm in obedience. And then generosity is with an open hand saying to God, the rest of this 90%, you tell me how to spend. Where our God is so gracious is He allows us to really enjoy it, but at times He guides us to give, like in season and in moments, give more generously, more sacrificial. So you have like the story of Jesus looking at the people who are giving their offerings, and you have religious leaders that are giving large sums of money and making a big deal about it. This woman goes up and gives like 2 copper coins or 2 mites, and she gives it, and Jesus goes, she gave more than all of them. Well, you would look at it and go, no, she didn't. She didn't give more than all of them, but Jesus wasn't looking at the amount because it didn't matter to Him. He was looking at the condition of the heart, and He said the reason she gave more is she gave out of poverty. So that her gift required a ton of faith. Her gift required a ton of sacrifice. Those are the things that mark generosity. And so, like, you can't have faith and you can't have sacrifice if you're not even meeting the bare minimum. Yeah. And so that's why I think when we look at the Old Testament, why I look at it and say, okay, I find some very valuable principles here. I have the baseline, the tithe belongs to God. And then above and beyond that, I go, okay, God, I want you to guide me. What is this giving? What should it look like? And it should be sacrificial, and it should be abundance to God. And so like for me, like even in Malachi, when God rebukes them, he says like, you left me. I want you to return to me. And they're like, how did we leave you? And he goes, well, you're robbing. And they go, how are we robbing God? And he says, with your tithe and contributions or offerings, right? Your tithe and above, like you're not being faithful or generous. And that's where I feel like most Christians aren't even being faithful. I mean, most Christians give 2 to 3% if they give anything at all. Yeah. And so like, that's that starting point. And it helps us. The other benefit of tithing to me is it helps us align our values and create that margin in our lives, because in order to give God 10%, you do have to have a certain level of discipline in your resources to make sure that that's happening.
Yeah, it makes me think of even you bringing up like Jesus talking about the Sabbath. I mean, you could ask the question like, well, why do we define that? Why not just say, hey, you should be resting? Like the problem is, I think for most of us is we number one, we can lie to ourselves, right? Like we can kid ourselves at times. And we can say, well, I am being restful. You know what I mean? Like every time I get home from work, I go home and I watch a show, whatever, but our lives are cluttered with busyness and overcommitment. And, in reality, we have no real margin and we're not being intentional in rest. I think the same can be said with generosity. It's like, oh yeah, I'm generous. I occasionally throw some money in the plate, whatever. Like we can kind of define our own terms. But I think a lot of times we live under an illusion of what we actually think we're doing and how it compares to what God really is calling us into. And I think so much of this it does come back to faith. And I think we often lose sight of that. We think of it only as a material thing. Like the idea of 10% on the surface is like, man, if you're not tithing, 10% is a massive amount of money. Right. Like if you're a person right now and you're like, I'm going to start tithing, to suddenly start giving 10% of your income. But even that, I mean, and you touched on this quite a bit, but like the orientation of your heart, realizing like I have two options in this moment. I can take 100% for myself, for many cases, more than 100% if we're living in debt. I can take this and do what I want with it. Or I can realize that by doing that, I'm trying to take control into my own hands, thinking to myself, living in this illusion that I'll be better if I do that, rather than honoring God in this way and inviting him into my finances, inviting him into my life, saying, Lord, this is going to hurt. This is going to be uncomfortable. I don't even know how I'm going to do this maybe. And I do think there needs to be some wisdom. And I love that you said that. Like we need to be intentional with the whole of our finances. It can't be, be reckless with it. And then, hopefully it works out. But even that idea of this stings, or I don't know how this is going to work out. Like you're inviting God into that to say, God, I want to honor you in this. And I'm trusting your provision. I'm trusting that you're going to come through. And even that is the shift of mind and heart to say, God, I want to put my full confidence in you because I know that I'm tempted to put my trust in money. And so I think 10% is even that number. I know we've talked too, like it's proportional, right? So like if you make $1,000 a week or $10,000 a week, it's not for the person who's struggling. I expect you to give $1,000 a week. Well, if I only make, $500 a week versus a person who makes $100,000 a month. I mean, there's people out there that make an insane amount of money. Like there's a fairness to that where everybody's in the same place in the sense of it still is enough to where it leads to faith, right? It leads to trust. Right. I have to trust God in this, but it's not a crushing expectation or a burden. And ultimately that's never God's intent, right? For anything that he commands us to do, for it to become a burden for us. Yeah.
It doesn't disqualify anybody.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody's invited and can participate and be obedient to what God's asking them to do. And so, you guys are breaking down like all the things that I had kind of come to my mind with it of like how it invites everybody kind of in to participate in the thing that God is doing in building the kingdom and being a part of it. Now, another thing that people will kind of push back against is, do I have to bring it all to the church? Does the 10%, does it belong to the church? Can I spread it across different organizations? How does that work? And how do I need to be faithful in that part of it?
Again, so where my convictions lie is you bring it to your church, whatever church you attend, because when you see in the scriptures, there was a concept of the storehouse, and it was the central spiritual community, but there was a really practical side to it. They brought their offering. So even when you're talking about biblical times, you're not talking as much a cash driven culture in the sense of their money units. It was more in their produce. It was more in their animals, in farming and things like that. But they brought those things, even in their sacrifices and in their tithes and offerings. When they brought it to the temple, that was meant to give to the Levites, who were the priests, and so that they could live, because they were not allowed initially to have their own land. So they spread out throughout all the different communities, and that's how they provided. And so when God challenges them, the people in Malachi, he says to them, like, bring it to my house, like my house, my storehouse. But that was his way of providing for the ministry. I think there's just a real practical side to that. So even in the New Testament, you see that concept. They're taking up offerings to fund the ministry. And so I think just on a practical side, there's some wisdom to that. If someone comes and they're legitimately supporting ministries with their money, I mean, I wouldn't, that's not a hill I'm going to die on. I would say, like, to a person, like, okay, but I think there's even a faith element of just surrendering it to the church and saying, like, this is my community, I'm part of this body, and God's called us to accomplish stuff, so I want to give that. I more lean toward, this is how Mary and I's convictions are. If we're going to give to other ministries, that comes out of our offering. That comes out of the above and beyond, because our convictions is give it to the church. I'm a part of the body. I want to support this ministry. The offerings are where I can be generous with other people.
Yeah. I don't have a lot to add to that. I mean, I would say I'm in the exact same place. Not in the sense that I don't think the New Testament is super dogmatic about that, because I do think you see some different variations of generosity happening. But I, kind of joked to you earlier, I think if we're trying to do math problems and it's like, well, I gave a percentage and a half to this organization, so I'm going to deduct that from my church giving. Like, I think even that, again, to go back, kind of misses the spirit of generosity and the desire to be open-handed with our finances. So I think, to just reiterate what you said, we're here locally, a part of this church, a part of this body, wherever that might be for you, right? And there is an element of trust to say, and there's lots of conversation to go around about this, but like godly authority, and if you believe your pastors and leadership, they're seeking the Lord and they're doing things according to what Scripture teaches, like there's an element of trusting that to them, where you're saying, God, I'm trusting them, I'm trusting the church, I'm a part of this church, to use it for the good of the body, to use it for the good of the community, so that the ministry would continue to go forth and make an impact here where I live. And so, I would be in the same exact boat. There are other things that like we give to that go above and beyond that, but that's just because we really believe in them and want to continue to be generous in those things as well.
And go ahead.
I was going to add that, like, I mean, what he's saying is, the theology around giving includes other things. So it also includes the theology of us being the body of Christ. And so when Paul talks about that principle of us all being connected and all of us playing a part, we need to understand that God gives his church visions. Like, this is what I want you to do. There's callings on them. Well, if he's giving this group of people a vision for something he wants them to accomplish, with that comes the expectation that those people fund that it's that calling based on what he's provided for them. And so everyone needs to do their part. So the same, when the language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, when he's talking about, 12 and following, where he's talking about the body, and he's like, if one person suffers, they all suffer. But it's the idea that if like one person doesn't do their job, then the body suffers.
Right.
And so if one person doesn't give what they're supposed to, the body suffers. And I can just speak bluntly to say that every single church in America is not reaching their full potential of their calling because Christians are not giving. If every single person who calls themselves a Christian and calls the Tree.Church home actually gave, financially gave, and tithe specifically, we would have, our vision would increase 100-fold. And I'm not exaggerating with that, to be able to start ministries in different places, even specific ministries. I mean, that's why in more distant history of America, almost every single hospital that started in the past was started by churches, organizations by churches, because people were tithing. They had greater resources to accomplish that. So nowadays, churches are limited in what they can do in their vision. And oftentimes, unfortunately, to our own hurt, we're failing to reach the full potential of what God's called us to do. And it's not because we don't have the vision or clarity, it's because we don't have the resources. And that creates a tension.
And I was going to say, I think some of the issue comes too, and we still view our faith as ours individually. And we don't think about the fact that faith is never divorced from the context of community.
Sure.
And so we always, the church has always been the center of giving. It's been the center of ministry. It's been the center of even missional advancement throughout the community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at the New Testament, they shared, they brought their things to the apostles distributed their needs to share with the community.
Yeah.
The apostles also oversaw taking care of the poor in their community. You know what I mean? And so like you get this picture of the church becomes this central hub of the gospel advancement and the kingdom advancement in certain communities. And I think we've lost that. I think it's too easy to go, I want to be careful how I want to say it, because I think we've got churches on every single corner. Like there's hundreds, if not thousands of churches, even in Lancaster. And I think that's not necessarily a terrible thing. You know what I mean? Like we've got options to find a ministry that our hearts connect with. But once we connect, fully investing in that and being a part of everything that they're doing. And then again, being open to going above and beyond when God has stirred our hearts for that. I think there are a lot of great organizations out there that we can contribute to and be generous with, or even just personal people that we know in our own lives. But the central focus of it stems around, what is our body doing? What are we doing as a community? Not just us as individuals.
Yeah, the funny thing is, like, even alluding to, like, you talked about hospitals, but like a lot of nonprofits have, hospitals have come from churches. Nonprofits that have become their own spin-off organizations started as the ministry of churches. I was thinking
universities.
I was just gonna say universities, orphanages. I mean, you name it. And you even think about that from like a practical level of how that impacts a community on so many different levels, like from an educational, from a physical health standpoint, spiritually, like all these different levels. And that's what generosity can do, right? And I think sometimes we over spiritualize things and we don't realize, okay, we live in a physical world. Like things take money, like that idea I think sometimes is lost on us when we're thinking only in terms of spiritual things. But the reality is all of these things take money. They take resources. And God, throughout, the story and the narrative of Scripture from Old into New Testament, has always viewed it that way. Like it's through the givings of the people, it's through the resources of the people. He stirs people's hearts to do these things, to align with Him, to trust Him, to be a contributor. I mean, that is one of the great narrative or parts of the like motifs of Scripture, is that God partners with humanity to do it. Yeah. And that should, I think, leave us room for pause in the sense of God doesn't have to do that. And so if He doesn't have to do that, that means it's actually an invitation to us. It's something that it should be a joy that we get to participate in. I mean, it's something that many times over the years, like I stop and I pause and I give thanks that, God, thank you for letting me be a part of what you're doing.
Yeah.
Because I realize I'm not deserving of it. Like I haven't earned some sort of standing with you. You have graciously called me and invited me into this to be able to join you and partner with you. Like, and I love that language, like being able to partner with you financially, with my time, with the gifts that you've given to me, because all of this has come from you. And I want to be able to join the work that you're doing and be a part of that. And I think that's such an amazing way of thinking about it versus having a perspective of like begrudgingly, this is something it's like that I get to versus I have to. We get to join God, and He invites us to be a part of that.
And I think that's even the heart behind Paul's thought with what he says in 2 Corinthians, do not give under compulsion. It is coming to that place of, because I think some people get this idea of like, well, because you set an amount, you set the number as a tithe, because you do that, like it's now not, I'm under compulsion.
It's a rule.
Yeah, it's a rule. And I think that misses the heart behind what it is. You know what I mean? And I think you nailed Paul's thrust behind give under what God's guided you to give. And so like being generous and being and even being faithful in this idea of, I'm going to set this standard practice for my life so that I can consistently do the things that God wants me to do. I think is so important. And you're right, it does. It provides the physical needs for the church in Jerusalem. There was a famine. They needed food.
Yeah.
So Paul encouraged the church to pray, ask, seek God, and what of above and beyond taking care of even your own community do you want to give towards supporting the body in Jerusalem.
And he's even honestly blunt about that. I actually find some level of humor of it where I referenced it earlier, where he's like, basically begin setting it aside because when I show up, like I want it to be ready. You know what I mean?
I'm going to take it, I got to go.
There's just like a practical element to it. And again, I think sometimes we can over spiritualize that and say, no, these are good things, like having discipline, being disciplined in these practices. like we do with many other things in life. I mean, most of the things in life that matter to us, there's some element of discipline to it so that we can make it a priority, so that we can do it well, so that we can do it consistently.
Yeah. So how does tithing, and I know you spoke to it in the message, but how does tithing put us in that place where we've talked about how it frees us up to have, or requires faith from us, but how do we find freedom? How do we get to the place where you described on Sunday, where we don't look at these decisions as financial decisions any longer? Yeah. How can somebody who's like, I hear you, I believe that, how do I take those steps?
Yeah, I think you find God's supernatural move in obedience. So I'm going to teach a message on this in the upcoming months. But there's this really interesting thing when God calls Moses to go and to speak to Pharaoh, and Moses is like, well, how will everyone know, and how will I know that you're with me? And God goes, you'll know that I called you when you lead the people out and I meet you back on this mountain. So he tells them, like, after you've obeyed and we have this moment, then you're gonna have this like really powerful faith moment where you're gonna look and say, God really was faithful. But he's like, it's gonna happen after obedience. And was God faithful with Moses all throughout? Yeah. But he was saying, you're going to have this special moment. I think the same thing with giving. Mm-hmm. I think it's after the fact. It could be a distant thing, because you have to make changes in your life in order to get to that place of generosity. So the testimony that I've shared, I was blessed that I was raised in the principle of tithing. That said, I'm not throwing any shade at my brothers or anything like that. I don't know that it connected with them as much as it did with me as a little kid, but it did with me. And so like my entire life I tithed. When I became an adult, God challenged me to give 20%, and I just started that process. The good of it my entire life is I've shaped my life on the 80%. I mean, like, so like my paycheck, I just viewed it that way. If I was paid $100, I just viewed, no, I have $80 to spend. How can I budget it? 20%, just goes to God. So when I got married, I remember even saying to Mary, this is a value that I've had. And she's like, yeah, absolutely. Like, so we together. Now at that time, we were what's modern day referred to as DINK, double income, no kids. So like it was easy.
I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, it's more popular now. You're hearing now that you've heard me say it, you'll see it other places. But like that was like, it was easier. Sure. Got to be honest. Like we lived in her grandfather's house. Our rent I think was $300. I mean, like we were making good money and stuff. Honestly, it wasn't as hard then. It was easy at that point. We moved to Ohio. God provided a job for me here. Mary got a job too, which was a supernatural thing. But that was one of the things I was saying. That wasn't a financial decision to move. It was an obedience decision. We never even once talked about the money. And I promise you, like that was not what we struggled with. We were like, God will provide. God will make a way. Even now looking back, I'm kind of shocked that we didn't have a financial discussion, but it just wasn't. Our faith was just so real. It was like, God's going to provide. So, but then when we moved here, and Mary, one of our values, again, I'm not saying everyone has to have these values, but our value was she wanted to stay home with our kids. I wanted her too. So we went to one income, now one kid. And so there's three of us. We cut back to 10% initially. I'm just being blunt here. I was underpaid at the church. And so like, I was like, man, this is going to be hard. Cut back. And it didn't take long, months before God challenged, like, no, get back up to the 20%. Well, in order to do that, we had to make changes in our budget. We had to become more disciplined in our finances. And the truth of it is we had to make sacrifices. I was literally, without exaggeration, living week to week. I had zero in savings. Mary and I had zero in savings during that season. We didn't have many luxury items. That was a season. I've talked about this before. Our dates were, one of us would put our kids down. One of us would go get fast food, bring it back. We would watch a TV show, eat fast food in the living room. And that was our date. It was a lot of fun. I cherish those moments, but it wasn't extravagant. And so we drove used cars. We were not, every year our vacation, we were blessed that my in-laws have a place in Michigan, on the west side of Michigan, but it was free. Besides our normal, like we have to get groceries here. So like the gas to get there is all it costs. So we didn't live extravagantly. The reason why I'm saying all these things is there's a lot of work that goes into it in order to honor God that way. But every single time that I've received a raise, when Mary went back to work, we did not adjust our lifestyle to now 100% of what we brought in. not only did we always give 20%, but then we started to increase savings. We started to increase investment into our retirement, and we just didn't adjust our lifestyle to 100%. So that if I actually told you how much we live on now, you would be shocked by it. Like, so now we're giving all of Mary's salary in this season with our church. And so, but we're probably living on what we're bringing in, like lower than 50% of what we were, maybe even less than that. But we have savings and different things. But again, there was a lot of work that went through. I say all of that to say is, after doing that for so many years, it just became my natural rhythm that I always want to have a bent toward generosity and faith with God. But every call that he's called us to do has never been a financial decision, because I've already surrendered that to God. And all those years ago, God's been nothing but generous with me. I've never been able to outgive God, from our son getting scholarships for college, from the house that I shared that testimony on Sunday, finding good deals on vehicles, to having family members that are generous with us. Mary's dad and mom, when she was still alive, very generous with us. So like, there's some moments in our lives that I look at it and go, God's been so generous. And I remember even one time thinking like, Mary's dad was super generous in helping us get a house. And I was like, what if he wasn't here? And I remember God saying, then I'd find another way. Like he had challenged me, and I was like, yeah. So again, it just took time, but it takes discipline too. I'm gonna share one more story real quickly. My kids recently, this is a really weird story, so give me a second to explain it. We were just talking about how other people can do other things, like certain vacations and, maybe bigger houses, nicer cars, things like that. And one of our kids, just like being a kid, asking questions, just said something along the lines of like, how come we can't do that? And Mary and I had to explain to them, we have the resources, like we make enough money to do that. We've chosen to invest our resources higher with the church and with God. And so we give a large portion, and the people we're talking about are not Christians. So this is not me throwing shade at a Christian. But we were just trying to explain to them that everyone picks and chooses what they prioritize. And so we have made sacrifices, there's no doubt about it, but God has been so good to us in so many other ways. And on top of it, I don't know how this is going to look, but I really am counting on the fact that I'm storing up treasures in heaven. And I don't know what that means. I'm not, in my mind, I'm not saying that like, oh, I hope I have a bigger house than everybody else. That's not my heart. Yeah. But like, I know there's an eternal reward, and I don't know what that is, but I'm excited to find out, like, what is that? I don't know. Like, it's going to be awesome to experience. And if the only reward I get in heaven is Jesus and eternal life, that's good. That's plenty. I'm being genuine about that. But I just know there's an eternal side to this that I don't fully understand, and I'm good with.
Yeah. Anthony, I was going to say, go ahead.
No, the kind of phrase I was thinking of, like when money is your most important thing, or the thing that you value most, money becomes the highest consideration. But when obeying God is the highest value of your life, then asking the question, what does God want me to do, becomes the most important question. So like, as a testimony of your life, that is how you have framed your life. It's not a financial decision in the sense of money is not the most important thing to you. That is subservient to your relationship with God and following him and being obedient to him. And I think that is the most challenging question that comes to all of us when we think about these types of things. Like, what we might feel like is a risk of generosity, because it's the what ifs, right? What if I do give? Well, then what if I don't have enough to make it? Yeah. Right. But what we're really actually asking, what if God doesn't come through for us? And so it really is a question of, what do I believe about God? Do I believe that God is faithful? Do I believe that God takes care of his people? Do I believe that God keeps his promises? And then if I can convince myself, yeah, absolutely, I believe those things, then your most important consideration should be, well, what is God calling you to do? Yeah. Because the idea of living life where, I think I always say this, but I do just genuinely think it's an illusion, right? We're more comfortable even in discomfort because we can see something, versus the idea of letting go into the unknown. Like, the unknown is profoundly uncomfortable. But I think so often when it comes to generosity, we want some sort of safety net, right? We want the guarantee. And we've talked about this many other podcasts. I know, like the illustration of the Indiana Jones, right? Stepping out. Like, we won't see it. We won't experience the provision of God and the faithfulness of God in the way that he wants to show it until we're willing to take those steps of faith. Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of people are at a crossroads. And I know you've said this on many occasions, and I agree with you. Like, at some point you have to take that step, right? There's no amount of convincing. I think we know what the scripture says in Romans 10, right? Faith comes, from hearing the word. Like, the idea of like, when you read the scriptures, like, God supernaturally does something. It's a grace that he gives to us, a reminder of his faithfulness and all that he's done. But at some point in time, it's not just filling up our heads. Like, we have to make a step. But when we begin to do that, as you guys, really what you just shared, the testimony of your life, you continue to see God's faithfulness and his provision come through. And those steps, in some ways, continue to increase, right? Like what God calls us to do. Not always, that doesn't always mean like the amount we're giving, particularly in this conversation, is increasing, but just the idea of like we have a greater confidence instilled in us in all arenas of life. And I think that's the other thing with this is so much bigger than just money, right? It 100%. Really is about entrusting our hearts and our lives to God and doing what he asks of us, knowing that he's faithful to come through, and that it's going to be far better with him than trying to cling to whatever it is we're clinging to do things our own way.
Well, I was going to say, think about the idea that God puts a passion on your heart and puts a calling on your heart, but you don't do it because you're afraid that, or you're afraid that it will change your income or your lifestyle, your financial lifestyle. That is essentially being enslaved to money.
Sure.
The practice of tithing is given to us to allow us to get to that place where we can make those steps of faith and realize when we come to that place, like my calling is now open. Like I can be obedient to God in the things that I do. I can be obedient to God in the way that I parent my kids. I can be obedient to God the way I love my spouse. I can trust that my heart will be satisfied no matter what the depth is of the thing that he asks to sacrifice. I think back on like when I became an intern here, that was a long time ago, 2008. Yeah. And just even that, like that wasn't ever a financial decision for us because, and I was able to take those steps. We had to make adjustments, and God provided in different ways. Cassie went to work full time, but the reason that we were comfortable in taking that step is because we had been faithful in our giving, and we did see how God provided, and that afforded us to be able to take that step in that season. And every other step that we've taken from that point forward, well, and even before that, but every other faith step we take, my mind always goes back to this moment where I've seen God tangibly come through for me in these ways. And tithing has really been the gateway for that faith building for me.
Sure.
So,
for sure. I mean, I was going to bring that up too. But what other way can you break the hold of money? I mean, when Jesus, and this is what I was talking about on Sunday, where he says you're either going to serve God or mammon, what other way breaks it?
Yeah.
How do you break it in your life if you're not going to give to God faithfully and generously? And so if you think saving enough money is going to break mammon, like that's counterintuitive, guys. Like that's not how it works. And I think about your story and my story. Like, so my story to get here to Lancaster, which is I'm really loving my life, but it required taking a less job for much less pay in a foreign city of people I didn't know. My Mary's sister and brother-in-law were here, and that was the only people we knew. You, same thing. I mean, giving up a job, that's a known thing to make a financial sacrifice and financial risk to now put you in the position that you were called for. You left to a foreign land without knowing anybody.
Not knowing anybody,
because God just stirred something in your heart, and you were willing to say, I'll go and I'll figure it out as I go. And now, hopefully, I would imagine all three of our faith has increased because of that. And so I look back and think, man, if money gripped my heart in Michigan, I would have missed out on this. And that's what we constantly are saying to people. Like I had years ago, I had someone, and I'm sure this still goes on. People will throw shade at me because they're like, Matthew, you talk about money all the time. Oh, you just want more money. I'm like, if you knew how little money matters to me, you would understand how silly that concept is.
Yeah.
I want everyone to experience the freedom that comes from trusting God with the provision of their lives.
Yeah.
So like, even for us, like when we made the sacrifice, what we're going through right now for the Not Coming Down initiative, I mean, we have one kid in college. We have another one going next year. I can't wait to see how God works that out. I mean, like that's genuinely where my faith is like either they're going to get more scholarships or God's going to provide some way that I just haven't seen yet. Or, you know what? We take student loans and then later on, God shows us how to pay them. Like, I don't know, but I can't wait to see because here's what I know. I followed what God's called me to do. And there's like genuine excitement with that and freedom because I don't have to be afraid. Like, when the economy goes down and inflation goes up and groceries go up, that's not a small thing. I'm not saying it's a small thing, but I don't go to fear.
Right.
And I go, you know what? I have to adjust my budget, which we've had to, but it's like, you know what? I can't wait to see how God works it out. And that's the joy I want people to have.
Well, I was going to say, you were talking about like the eternal reward, but I think it brings reward now.
100%
like
does.
We get to relax and trust God in the process of all of these circumstances that could be highly stressful things. And when we live our lives in a way that is fully surrendered to God, we're able to live from a place of of peace, of joy, of knowing that God has our back no matter what we face. And I think that brings a lot of freedom and a lot of reward, even in the immediate. Yeah. And who knows what the reward will be in heaven, but we even experience it now. So
yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for the discussion. Any other closing thoughts or anything else that you guys wanted to hit on before we wrap up today's conversation?
The only other thing I would highlight is I think giving to God first is a big part of the habit.
Sure.
Before you pay any other bills, give to God first as you give, because I think that really is a major part of the faith side of it. Mm-hmm. And that's what you see over and over in Scripture is the call to give first. And God, always when he's commanded that, God's never needed anything. That command's all throughout the Bible. And the reason it's there is because that's the faith portion. And I encourage people, that is a big step, because if you give to God first, then you will honestly spend your money differently. You will budget differently too. There's a practical side to that.
Sure.
I think when people wait to the very end, they've allotted money in places and then they go, oh, I can't afford it. I'm like, you will learn to live within it when you give to God first, because we all would do it. I mean, your car breaks, you're like, I can't afford anything. Your car breaks down, you find a way, right? You move money.
Right.
If you put God first, then it helps you with the other part. And that's a practice I would encourage people to do.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you guys again so much for these insights, and we hope that this was beneficial. I hope it answered some of the questions that maybe you've even had in your heart about why tithing is taught here, why we value it so much in the process of God freeing us from our grip on money, and and I think we would all say there's the potential in all of us to be gripped by money, and this practice is a life-giving thing that we've been offered by God. And so I hope that it's beneficial for you. I hope it helps you take that next step to take that step of faith. And I can't wait to hear the stories of how God is blessing you through your obedience. And so take those steps of faith and join us next week as we talk about the next sermon. So love you guys. Have a great week.